Okay, welcome everyone. We appreciate especially Congress members and their staff being here today for the first and what will be several congressional briefings hosted by the National Radioactive Waste Coalition. My name is Tim Judson, Executive Director of the Nuclear Information and Resource Service, a founding member of the coalition. I will be your moderator for today's presentation, Nuclear Waste on the Front Lines, False Solutions and Guiding Principles. We will begin the presentation shortly, but first a little bit about the National Radioactive Waste Coalition. We are a growing alliance of more than 40 grassroots, regional, and national organizations. Many of our member groups are based in communities where nuclear waste is stored or are targeted for waste storage. We formed the coalition in 2020 to address one of the most pernicious problems with nuclear waste, the storage and management of irradiated or quote spent nuclear fuel and high-level radioactive waste from both commercial nuclear power plants and weapons production. For more than 80 years, the federal government has failed to come up with a policy and technology for the long-term management of these wastes, which would be workable, and this waste will remain an environmental hazard for more than 1 million years. The Nuclear Waste Policy Act, originally enacted in 1982, does set forth a national policy for establishing geologic repositories for the long-term storage of these nuclear wastes, but amendments made in 1987 limited the search for repository sites to a location at Yucca Mountain on Western Shoshone land in Nevada. That site proved technologically and politically infeasible, but little meaningful legislation has been enacted since then. The DOE has failed to chart a different course for long-term management, and Congress has failed to amend the Nuclear Waste Policy Act to remove the logjam created by the sole designation of Yucca Mountain. Several bills have been predicated on findings and recommendations in the report of a panel established by President Obama, the Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Future, and that is one of the topics of today's briefing. The BRC conducted public meetings and issued a report with 6 recommendations in 2012. The NRWC summarized the findings of the BRC's report in a letter sent to all members of Congress and the White House in December 2021. Many of our coalition's members, including 2 of our presenters today, engaged extensively with the BRC and will provide a deeper perspective on the commission and the implications of its report. One of the commission's recommendations was to establish processes for siting nuclear waste facilities based on achieving the consent of communities where they would be located, due to the repeated success of communities, tribal governments, and states in defeating nuclear waste site proposals. The DOE has conducted 3 public comment periods on consent-based siting for so-called centralized interim storage facilities since 2016, which Rose Gardner will discuss from the perspective of communities that are being targeted for CIS. Our coalition was formed to address the failures of federal nuclear waste policy and the dangers nuclear waste poses to communities at every stage of these problems. Reactor communities where waste is stored now, and nuclear weapons facilities, communities targeted for interim and long-term storage, and communities through which waste would be transported. Our goals include the termination of the Yucca Mountain project, prevention of centralized interim storage, greater protection of reactor communities where waste is stored now, and environmentally just, scientifically sound, and democratic policies for nuclear waste in the future. To that end, we have developed a set of guidelines of principles for equitable and humane nuclear waste policy. That will be the final topic of today's briefing. First, you will hear from Rose Gardner, founder of the Alliance for Environmental Strategies, based in Eunice, New Mexico, located between 2 proposed CIS facilities. Next will be Dave Kraft, Executive Director of the Nuclear Energy Information Service, established in 1981 in Chicago, Illinois, and Deb Katz, Executive Director of the Citizens Awareness Network, founded in 1991 in Western Massachusetts, near the Yankee Row and Vermont Yankee nuclear power plants. Finally will be Leona Morgan, an Indigenous community organizer and activist, and founder of the Nuclear Issue Study Group based in Albuquerque, New Mexico. We will have questions and answers after the presentations, so please type your questions into the chat box. We will keep track of them there and get through as many as we can before the hour is up. So with that, I'll hand it over to Rose Gardner of Alliance for Environmental Strategies. Rose?
Hey, good morning, everybody. I'm Rose Gardner. And the goals of the National Radioactive Waste Coalition are especially important to me. As a resident of Eunice, New Mexico, I live 5 miles from Waste Control Specialists, Interim Storage Partners, which has recently received their license from the NRC for storing high-level nuclear waste from commercial reactors. I have maintained my opposition against storage of nuclear waste, both low and high level, waste control specialist for many years. At this point in New Mexico, we have another company by the name of Holtec International that is awaiting the same license to store high-level commercial irradiated waste. It's important to note that the Texas governor has opposed the storage of high-level nuclear waste in Texas and has instructed the regulators in the state to not allow permits to be issued to the facility. The New Mexico governor and land commissioner are opposed to licensing Holtec. Several communities in New Mexico have passed resolutions against Holtec. Although Holtec has not been licensed, the Attorney General for New Mexico filed a suit with a 51-page complaint. My understanding is that there are legislators working on a bill that would somewhat limit the issuance of permits in New Mexico, as well as to create a task force to oversee a project like this. I would like to point out that in these situations I've described in New Mexico and Texas, there has never been any consent from the public to store commercial irradiated waste in their states. These projects come by way of business leaders and local governments that seek to expand the job base. What they are missing is the consent of the public, especially related to nuclear waste and or nuclear power generation. New Mexico is home to hundreds of abandoned uranium mines. We are home to laboratories that create bombs. We're home to bombed areas that created downwind fallout during nuclear testing. We're home to WIPP, the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant, a more than 2,000 feet deep underground repository the weapons making waste. A reminder, in 2014, WIPP had an underground fire and a major leak of radioactive material. The breach has cost billions to attempt to remedy and is still not fully repaired. Then comes Holtec with their plan to create below surface storage in New Mexico to store all of the irradiated commercial waste in America. Waste Control Specialist Interim Storage Partners in Texas plan for 40,000 metric tons of commercial irradiated waste. That would mean I'd have a nuclear dump 5 miles from my home and then a nuclear dump 35 miles from my home. This will result in constant irradiated fuel transport through my town and family members that live near the railroad and the Texas-New Mexico state line. I consider that a grave environmental injustice to my community, to my family, and to this non-consenting state. New Mexico is home to one of the biggest oil extraction industry areas in the country. Our job is to supply oil and natural gas to you so that you can get around and do the business of running this country. There are many oil-related industries in the area of Holtec International, which is sited between Carlsbad and Hobbs, New Mexico. The oil and gas industry is a very important part of this state, as well as the potash industry, which surrounds the Holtec International site. And the state owns the mineral rights under the Holtec International site. With the oil and gas industry being all around me, I believe that it is a polluting industry, and that, coupled with the other history of uranium extraction and nuclear projects in New Mexico, should be considered an environmental injustice. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Rose. And again, if you have questions, please put them in the chat and we'll get to those after the presentations are concluded. Next, I'll hand it over to Dave Kraft of the Nuclear Energy Information Service.
Thank you, Tim, and good morning, everyone. The inappropriately labeled Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Future, the BRC, was established in January 2010 predominantly to conduct a comprehensive review of policies for managing the back end of the nuclear fuel cycle. While examining a number of major issues pertaining to the generation, storage, transport, and ultimate disposal of the nation's high-level radioactive waste, it generated results more akin to a study to show as opposed to a study to know. The BRC and its attendant public meetings were dominated by nuclear power advocates, promoters and beneficiaries in government, academia, industry, and the nuclear industry sector. Principles and proposals for high-level radioactive waste management first developed and advocated by Safe Energy Advocates in 2001, 9 years prior to the creation of BRC, were given only perfunctory and grudging platform, and then largely ignored and not incorporated into the final report. While the Commission charter was explicit about, quote, managing the back end of the nuclear fuel cycle, Energy Secretary Stephen Chu made it abundantly clear several times in the first BRC meetings on March 25, 2013, that he was giving flexibility to the BRC to consider front-end options and how those would affect the back-end outputs. Seem to be having some problems here with my slides, so if you just give me a moment here, see if I can correct that. Well, anyway, I'll move on. Secretary Chu advised, and I quote, "I think it's safe to say that unless you step back and look at it all, if you just focus on just a tiny portion, we will probably not get to the wisest path." Because of this wide latitude explicitly granted by the Secretary, let me just turn this off for a moment. Be right with you here. Oh, still not with me. Sorry. Because of this wide latitude granted by the Secretary, it was incumbent on the BRC to analyze and incorporate into its final recommendations not only the principles of waste management, but also the principles of waste minimization. In other words, don't produce it. The BRC did not merely fail to do this, it utterly ignored this crucial second principle completely. Demonstrating the GIGO principle, the BRC, in its final analysis, disregarded this latitude to examine all aspects of nuclear power and their impacts on the creation of high-level radioactive waste, resulting in a myopic and incomplete set of conclusions, largely self-serving of the ongoing interests of the nuclear industry and its advocates, and certainly not of the many members of the public whose input was disregarded. As a result, all subsequent debate in Congress and elsewhere has been artificially skewed towards serving the short-term and financial interests of the nuclear industry and its friends and advocates, rather than satisfying the long-term need for a final high-level radioactive waste disposal solution. Among the current, more controversial and cherry-picked BRC recommendation items are: 1. Construction of expensive and unnecessary so-called centralized interim storage high-level radioactive waste facilities, which you just heard about from the previous speaker, Rose Gardner, in West Texas and New Mexico. And both of these are being done in the absence of any progress towards establishing a permanent disposal facility, which was also a BRC recommendation. Second, allowing the use of the Nuclear Waste Fund to pay for transportation to and operation of the CIS before the final disposal repository is in operation. Third, a new, allegedly so-called consent-based approach to siting future nuclear waste management and disposal facilities. And finally, an implied large-scale transport of spent fuel to CIS and disposal facilities without prior adequate preparations and improvements in the national transportation infrastructure. Since 2012, several inept and/or failed attempts by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the Department of Energy to address the nation's high-level radioactive waste issues have occurred. The first was in 2013, the so-called waste confidence rule fiasco, where U.S. courts ordered the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission to discard and rewrite previously unsupportable rules on high-level radioactive waste management and reactor licensing. The second was the DOE's unmandated and failed initiative in 2016 and 17 to conduct, quote, consent-based siting public scoping meetings, a process designed more to legitimize the creation of more radioactive waste rather than solve the current waste problems. Subsequent events have demonstrated the inadequacies of basing congressional debate and legislation on these narrowly focused and cherry-picked 2012 BRC recommendations. New and important considerations not known or even contemplated back in 2010 and 12, when the BRC was finalized, magnify those inadequacies. Among these are the nuclear industry violation of environmental justice principles and concerns, the ever-changing and worsening predicted effects of catastrophic climate disruption, the industry and NRC plans both to extend the operating lifetimes of current reactors and hence high-level radioactive waste production to as much as 80 years, and also to increase the high burnup fuel use in the reactors, changing the radioactive inventory and content of that radioactive waste considerably. And finally, the industry, NRC, and current administration plans to create an entire new fleet of so-called small modular nuclear reactors, which will change and add to the waste burden. To summarize, the recommendations of the BRC report, number 1, failed in its initial mission. Number 2, are anachronisms given the changes in the nuclear industry and the world has moved on in these past 10 years. And finally, they continue to fail to adequately address both the previous and current safety, environmental, and justice concerns of the safe energy community and the general public. In December 2021, the National Radioactive Waste Coalition, representing over 40 safe energy, environmental, and environmental justice organizations, sent a letter to the President and the Congress outlining the inadequacy of using the BRC recommendations as a basis for future radioactive waste legislation. Today, we come before you to express explicitly a new set of principles for humane and equitable nuclear waste policy that should serve as the guiding template for the development of any future legislation dealing with the creation, management, storage, transportation, and disposal of high-level radioactive waste. These principles will now be presented by my colleagues. Thanks for your consideration, and I'll put my email in the chat if you have any questions.
So thank you, Dave. We actually had your slides up. If there's any of those that you wanted to show, just let us know.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Well, with that, we'll come to our next presentation from Deb Katz of the Citizens Awareness Network. And as I mentioned before, if you have any questions, please just put them in the chat, and we will get to those after the presentations are concluded. Deb, you're on mute.
Oh,
there you go.
My town was host to the first commercial reactor in America, the Yankee Row reactor. Why? Because we were a working, poor farming community in Western Massachusetts. The reactor sits on the banks of the Deerfield River that winds through 9 small towns in our valley. Many promises were made to my community, many broken. The corporation maintained the reactor was safe, non-polluting, and that when it shuttered, the site would be returned to unrestricted use and its former beauty. None of this was true. The reactor routinely released radioactive waste into our local river that runs through those 9 small towns, a river where our kids swim, where we fish, boat, in water we use to irrigate crops in drought. Our schools are on the banks of that river. Not only did the corporation pollute the river, it cooled the reactor with river water, sucking hundreds of millions of gallons of river water every day, only to return heated water that undermined the river and destroyed aquatic life. This company controlled our waterways and our lives. It bought people's silence by donating needed services like ambulances, school computers, and teaching science classes. People were afraid to speak openly. Those that did were threatened. Not only did it undermine our river, it undermined our lives. We suffered an epidemic of disease with statistical significance in cancers, a 10-fold increase in children with Down syndrome, high rates of miscarriage, heart disease, immune deficiency diseases, and children with disabilities. Less than 8,000 people live in our valley. There shouldn't be any statistical significance. My husband said, we paid our electric bills at our medical centers. Our community suffered an unbearable assault, but we're not unusual. This is the reality for all nuclear communities. This is the broken promise of routine operation. And when Roe shuttered, its failed policy regarding nuclear waste was exposed. The contamination was so widespread that the site has yet to be released some 30 years later for what the Nuclear Regulatory Commission calls unrestricted use. There are plumes of contamination that migrated 300 feet down into the groundwater. Some of these plumes contaminated our river. Then the corporation announced it would ship its low-level waste 900 miles or so to Barnwell, South Carolina, a 46% working poor African-American community. We couldn't accept that the waste that hurt us could hurt another. We fought those shipments, raising awareness about the industry's environmental racism. What remains at Roe? 40 million curies of high-level waste on the banks of the river with no destination, no solution. The industry's plan, creating temporary storage 2,000 miles away in Andrews County, Texas. This waste will be dangerous for 1 million years. This is the colossal failure of nuclear power. There is no present solution to deal with the brutal legacy of Yankee Roe or any other reactor. The Blue Ribbon Commission was impaneled to take testimony from citizens about their concerns. Did they come to my community or near the New England communities checkered with nuclear reactors? No. It was held in Wiscasset, Maine, some 400 miles away. We organized participation and traveled 4 hours each way to testify about our concerns and our betrayal. We raised the issue of broken promises, the vulnerability of fuel pools, dry cask storage, and the need to harden the casks in a post-9/11 world. We raised the National Academy of Science report that acknowledged that the reactor fuel pools were vulnerable to acts of malice. Their advisory that the fuel should be transferred to dry cask storage and that the casks themselves should be protected. These recommendations were communicated to the NRC. What did the NRC do? Nothing. What did the Blue Ribbon Commission recommend to address the concerns of reactor communities? Nothing. So what was accomplished? A promotion of nuclear power without addressing the abdication by the nuclear industry or the federal government to address the monstrous waste problem they created. What it did recommend fell far short of what reactor communities need. Instead, it advocated for interim storage, consent-based siting, albeit developed by an independent body, and lip service to a permanent solution. What has the government done to address these recommendations? Just about nothing, except putting DOE in charge of hearing citizen concerns regarding consent. Is that an independent body? And the industry? It's moving forward, targeting working poor Hispanic communities in the Southwest, overwhelmingly opposed by state and local governments alike. How is that for consent? This is environmental racism and reprehensible. The industry targets working poor, people of color, and indigenous tribes for its nuclear fuel chain. It pits reactor and targeted communities against each other over who will suffer nuclear power's final solution. For the DOE and the industry to focus on consent and interim storage continues their abdication to develop a scientifically sound and environmentally just solution to this monstrous problem, our monstrous problem. Why would any reactor or targeted community believe them given their abject failure? Citizens Awareness Network opposes these false solutions. Without a permanent repository, any establishment of centralized interim storage is merely a way to make the industry's waste problem disappear. Potentially, it will de facto become the industry's permanent solution. We can't accept that another community will suffer to clean our community up. We accept that the waste must remain on site until the government does its job. This isn't easy. Dangers remain. Fears of the vulnerability of the canisters to terrorism. They sit in the open on a pad on the banks of the river. Then there is climate change. The Roe reactor sits on those banks of the Deerfield River. Above it are two reservoirs, the Sherman Reservoir and Harriman. In Hurricane Irene, the workers repeatedly released water from the dams, fearing it would break, driving a 20-foot wall of water down into the valley, including our town's nuclear waste canisters. We live with the ticking clock of disaster, and no one hears it, but the communities bearing the burden. Citizens Awareness Network wakes people up in a world that wants them to stay asleep. I'm here to wake you up about our plight and the plight of all nuclear communities. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Deb. And next we'll turn to our final presenter, Leona Morgan of the Nuclear Issue Study Group. Leona?
Hi, good morning. I am here as a member of the National Radioactive Waste Coalition and also representing the group in Albuquerque that Tim mentioned, Nuclear Issue Study Group. And as a member of that group, our organization is, we're really focusing on getting young people involved and trying to present the nuclear issue in plain language for people and to make it more accessible, which is one of the reasons why our national coalition is having this webinar to talk about these things and explain why we formed these principles, which I'll present in a minute. I am from the Navajo Nation. My people have been severely impacted by uranium mining, which Rose spoke about earlier. We have about, it's estimated 15,000 abandoned uranium mines across the country. And this is a different type of waste than Deb was explaining a minute ago. And I want to also highlight, Rose talked about WIPP. WIPP is a completely different type of waste site, which is already in New Mexico. And along with not just the uranium sites and the various multiple waste sites in New Mexico, I just want to highlight we have so many waste sites across the country, such as Hanford and other places that are severely contaminated, including the White Mesa Mill, which is also adjacent to the Navajo Nation in the Four Corners region. And I bring these areas up because these are all in places where people are still dealing with the impacts from those facilities. We're still dealing with the contamination. We're dealing with contaminated water. And as Indigenous peoples, this not only impacts our health and the environment, but our relationship to that water and how we use the water and the mountains and the places where uranium was mined and all of these nuclear sites. When they're contaminated, it affects how our people access them, collect medicines, and also the animals. And of course, we still eat these animals. So our people, our culture, and the future of our culture is irreparably damaged. So this is something, the number one priority, that the number one principle is to stop making waste. But I just want to also highlight right now, along with the principles, one of the reasons, a couple of reasons why we started to create these principles are also to highlight the principles of environmental justice and also the Hamas principles of democratic organizing. These are documents that were written a long time ago that we're striving to use as guidelines for our work. And we also promote them for other organizations to use as well. And so they inform our principles, and they also are the reasons why we are doing our work a little bit differently and more holistically. So you might think this presentation was just on high-level waste, but it's important to bring up the uranium, the front end of the nuclear fuel chain, the middle steps, as well as the back end. And so right now, one of the most important things I want to highlight is RECA. The Radiation Exposure Compensation Act is something that was created in the 90s to help to provide funding to people who were affected by the United States atomic legacy, but it is not inclusive of uranium miners who worked after 1971, and it's not inclusive of a lot of people who were impacted by nuclear test sites, namely the people impacted by the Trinity site, which was the first nuclear test here in New Mexico. And so this is a bill that is going to sunset this summer, which is very important that you all know there are a lot of efforts to continue RECA. And even though the timing is not right, I'm asking that you support any efforts to make or to extend RECA now and in the future, because we need the compensation for our people and the descendants of these people who were impacted by the atomic legacy, not just the Manhattan Project, but all of these nuclear issues today. And on top of that, the Trinity site residents were never even given an apology. So the work that we're doing, it's very inclusive of the nuclear fuel chain, not just the high level waste. Okay, so I'm going to present the principles. And a lot of our folks who are here today, we put these together because we live near these sites. So it's not just a matter of not in my backyard, especially as Indigenous peoples. We don't do these things just for ourselves, but it's really for the entire health of our Mother Earth. And then also when we think about the next generations, and you might have heard the concept 7 generations. So we look to the past, we see what has happened and here in the present, and we look 3 generations in the past and assess what's going on, and then plan for 3 generations into the future. I'm sorry, was there someone speaking? Okay, so these are the principles. There's 6 of them, and we are asking you to use these to apply them to federal policy and legislation. These are guiding principles which have to do with not just nuclear power, not just the waste from the nuclear power, but the entire nuclear fuel chain. Okay. So from all the speakers here today, we heard of all the horrible issues with nuclear waste. And the United States, as Dave presented, was trying to create, some process to address the waste issue. However, the number one thing we need to do is to stop making nuclear waste. Just to backtrack a little bit, during the BRC process, the United States held national meetings, and they only held 5. I attended one in Arizona, but they did not have one in New Mexico, which is interesting because New Mexico and Texas are the only places entertaining proposals for the temporary storage of nuclear waste. Now, the second principle is to prioritize human health and environmental protection. As you heard from all the speakers here today, this is something I know a lot about, especially with uranium cleanup. A lot of times the prioritization is on, as it says here, we need to protect the health and safety of the environment, not the nuclear industry profits and subsidies. And so we need to put funding to our people, to our environment, and not to the nuclear companies. This is very important, as well as cleanup standards that also prioritize human health, not nuclear worker health. Community health, the health of children, the health of women, and those who are the most impacted from radiation. So the next principle, acknowledge and combat environmental racism and injustice. So this is another thing where, for example, Indigenous peoples have been targeted, and almost, I'm going to use a strong word. I'm going to say Indigenous communities were bribed to take this nuclear waste. We know there's a lot of efforts that had happened in the past, and we're still dealing with this, not just at Yucca site, at Yucca Mountain, but the sites here in New Mexico, and of course in our history. But this is something that may come up in the future. So we need to stop dumping on people of color and those who are already bearing the burden of the nuclear industry. Stop subsidizing the sources of nuclear waste. So again, we're talking about prioritizing corporations over people. And this is, again, I'm going to bring up Hanford. We put billions of dollars into Hanford every year, but how much money do we put into RECA? And RECA is going to sunset this year. This is not okay. We have our priorities backwards as a country. Communities must have the first and last word. Well, again, this is why we're speaking up today, because we have never been at the table when these decisions are made. We, as community people, especially as Indigenous peoples, we were never given free, informed, and prior consent about any of these projects. So our people, you know, some people needed jobs and they were never told these jobs can kill them, or these jobs will kill their children when they're bringing home uranium waste, you know, on their clothes or in their lunch buckets. So today we must change that and make sure the communities, especially when we're talking about consent-based siting, as Rose said earlier, the communities did not consent to these proposals. These were for-profit corporations that went forward to create these proposals, not communities that will be impacted. And one last thing is to highlight all of the transportation communities. And many of them, many have no idea that the waste is even going to go through their community, much less what are the possible impacts, which I heard one company guy tell my state officials, oh, it's no big deal. It's just like getting an X-ray. But again, we do not consent. We do not consent to these temporary sites. We do not consent to making more waste. We do not consent to these so-called harmless X-rays. This method, the ways our country works to protect industry needs to change, and you all can help to do that, to make sure organizations like ours and individuals and people like Rose and Deb and Dave and others who are working on these issues are heard and included at the decision-making table. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Leona, and thanks to all of our presenters. And again, if you have a question, you can put that in the chat and we'll get to it as soon as we can. We're going to start with a question. I think this is mostly for Rose and Leona, but I think you know, if Deb or Dave want to comment on it as well, that's fine. But you know, you've sort of, you know, I guess maybe what's wrong with the idea of consent-based siting? I mean, I think to most people it kind of sounds like the way that these things should be done. But you know, but you've both been involved in the processes that DOE has been, you know, going through the last few years, and so kind of can you give us a sense of, you know, what's wrong with the way that this is being done?
Tim, this Rose. The thing that's wrong with it is that there is no outreach to get consent from me or the regular folks. These companies come to the area and they'll give one big briefing and tell and spout all the good things about themselves. They allow you a little time to speak. You're limited to what, 2, 3, 4 minutes. And then it's on to the next person. But these meetings are so crowded with industry professionals that they take up the majority of the time spent promoting these same companies, and not enough time giving the regular guy a chance to say no. And they don't take no. It's like well, that's irrelevant. You don't get a vote. So that's what is wrong. And I'm not sure that there's a remedy for it because they're not coming to my home. Holtec has never been to Eunice. Holtec went to Hobbs, but they never came to see us. And we're just as impacted as any other member of this state. Maybe Leona would like to add more.
Yes, sorry. I would like to highlight, actually, if I could share my screen again, I want to highlight the way that the NRC in particular has dealt with these issues. This consent-based siting process that took place a few years ago, like I mentioned, there was only 5 meetings across the country. And I happened to be available to attend a meeting in another state that took a lot of energy to attend. It cost a lot of money, it took a lot of time. And so it was not accessible to, people that are in impacted communities, meaning it was not in a place that actually is going to probably, that at the time we knew Holtec and WCS were sites that were at risk, and we knew that we were being threatened, yet these meetings were not held in our communities. So that's the number one thing that's wrong with this process is you can call something anything you want, but that doesn't mean that's what it really is. And the way they did it was not equitable. I'm showing this image. The reason why I'm showing this image is because as a Diné person, this here is what we call the Navajo Nation, this orange splotch here. However, my people, we believe this is our homeland, which is within the 4 sacred mountains. Now, if you look at this green line, this is one of the rail lines that goes from east to west and whatever, west to east. It's the main rail line that goes through the northern part of our state. And we imagine the transportation of the waste can take any route. We don't know the route. We won't know until it's actually moving. I think 4 days is the amount of time that people are given, which is not enough time when you're talking about one of the biggest concerns when we're talking about transportation through the reservation is people have animals. There's a language barrier. And so when the Holtec applied, Holtec applied for a consolidated interim storage license here, very close to Rose's home, even though it's on the other side of the state. When they applied, the NRC sent 11 letters nationally to the tribes they thought were going to be impacted. There's over 575 federally recognized tribes. There's more tribes that are not recognized by the federal government. So there's hundreds of indigenous nations that were not notified. And this is just one. My nation is along the railroads, and we happen to have 2 sacred mountains. So this is an issue for me that's very personal because of the cultural impact. But the fact that the NRC only sent 11 letters, and on top of that, our people as indigenous nations require a different way of government to government communications, and that has never been respected. We have a council, we have a calendar. The NRC and Holtec has never come to my council to present any of these proposals. They have never invited in person to my people, with a translator, to be a part of the consolidated interim, to be a part of the consent-based siting process. So this is an issue that from the root of it is inherently racist, and we need to stop it. So I'm gonna just stop talking now and stop sharing this with me.
Great, thank you, Leona. I think we see, we have Dave's hand up, and then Deb.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that just today, an academic colleague of ours and his team are releasing a study that they did on how to get to consent basis. And the point I want to make, I think Leona and Rose encapsulated it in the front lines, is that this notion of consent, the word sounds so innocent, but it is fraught with minefields of misunderstanding, and things that have to be dealt with far in advance of going into the communities. For example, who gets to consent? What is the geographic distribution of that? What are you consenting about? Are the standards going to be done in advance? Are they going to be done as you go along? Who can modify those? Who gets compensated? I could go on and on, but what I would suggest is, if you're really interested in finding more about this, put your email in the chat box and I will send you Seth Tueler's contact information, and you can discuss it with him in detail about his study results. Thank you.
Great, Deb?
Well, basically, the NRC and the DOE elevate form over substance. So they read in the Blue Ribbon Commission that a consent process was needed, even though it was specifically said the DOE should not do it since they have a dog in the fight. So the very stance that the DOE then takes on doing it is a statement of the outcome, which is that there is a need to control the outcome, which remains targeting people who have the least power to protect themselves or their communities from the onslaught of the nuclear industry and the federal government. And this is historically true, and it is true now. And the whole process has to stop. It's ass backwards. What they have to do is deal with the fact that they are bankrupt in terms of having a solution to the nuclear waste. And until they deal with that really hard issue, the rest of it is absurd and bankrupt. And in a certain way, it's the emperor's new clothes. They don't want to talk about what they can't do. And yet that's what we're pushing for, is them to actually take on the responsibility that they have advocated all this time and actually protect people and protect the environment from the most deadly waste we have ever created.
Well, thank you, Deb. And why don't we turn for our next question actually to that topic? We know that there's a lot of clamor and concern from reactor communities, from nuclear weapon site communities about the danger that these wastes pose to them. If we're rather than dumping it into communities for these consolidated interim storage sites, what should really be done to protect reactor communities?
Well, what CAN has advocated for, and in fact, in a summit we held in Connecticut where we brought reactor and targeted and waste communities together to look at the issues of environmental racism, but also to attempt to find ways to protect reactor communities, to go with the fact that they had not lived up to their promise, was, and this is after 9/11, to deal with the issue of hardening the waste on site. The canisters throughout America sit on pads, for the most part, out in the open. Some are protected to varying degrees. Basically, I might as well have a sign on them that says, "Hit me," because they are vulnerable to acts of malice, as many experts have talked about. In fact, the National Governor Association of America has called the waste at reactor sites pre-deployed weapons of mass destruction. And instead of dealing with this, or dealing with the National Academy of Science advocating for protecting the waste on site, they have refused to deal with that issue, and in fact are doing dog and pony shows basically to obscure the basic problem, which is securing the waste on site so they can actually find competent solutions. But corporations don't want to lay out the money, and they don't want to acknowledge that the waste is dangerous. They just want to get rid of it and ship it somewhere where they can forget about it and target a community that doesn't have the power to fight back.
Great, thanks for that, Deb. And does any of the other presenters want to address that topic?
Well, this is Dave again. Just quickly, the community of Zion north of Chicago has recently concluded tearing down 2 reactors at site and has 63 canisters 400 yards from Lake Michigan. There were several congressional briefings held over the last couple of years dealing with decommissioning, and we can certainly provide the links to that. But I would call to attention the fact that at one of those hearings, the former mayor of Zion mentioned that initially he wanted to get the waste out as soon as possible. He didn't care where it went. But over time, talking to frontline communities like Leona's and Rose's, and talking with the activists who put together these principles, he said, no, we need to make the waste on site as safe as possible, and we need to economically compensate the communities that have been damaged by becoming de facto high-level radioactive waste dumps. So that's an interesting turnabout. A mayor really wants to, protect his community, and for him to say, I've rethought my position and I would not inflict this on somebody else, is quite a testimonial to what we're talking about in terms of endorsing Haas.
Great, Leona?
Hi, so I think I would just ask folks to consider, when we're talking about keeping the waste on site, we're not saying forever. We're saying there needs to be a scientifically sound permanent solution. There's no need to move it now. It's been proven the waste can stay there for some time. So it seems like people are forgetting that we have 15,000 abandoned uranium mines and things like WIP and Hanford that are permanently there. And we want to get rid of that waste too, but those are not being cleaned up. Excuse me, my tea is boiling.
Great, thanks, Leona. And we'll let you come back and finish that thought if you want to. So, I think a number of the presenters, including Leona and Deb, mentioned the concerns facing communities through which waste would be transported. And I wonder if you can kind of say some more about, about what the concern is there, and why in particular it's also important to consider, the impacts on not just the communities where the waste is generated and targeted to be stored, but also the communities that are in between.
I can wrap up my previous thought and answer this if you want to. So we have several abandoned uranium mine sites, again, that are not being cleaned up, and there's no laws to clean them up. In New Mexico, we did pass a law to clean up abandoned uranium mines, but that still is dependent on federal dollars. And so we need to focus on cleaning up all sites, not just the reactor sites where people in big cities are scared of the waste. We've been living with these wastes for decades, and our people have been dying for decades. And so that's why the Navajo Nation has passed a law to say no more uranium mining. This was in 2005. We also passed a law to say no transport of radioactive waste through our communities in 2012, because of our lived experience from transportation of uranium and other radioactive materials through our nation. When there's accidents, when there's things that happen, oftentimes it's gone unreported. I've heard many, many stories about accidents with uranium trucks. Now, this waste is much, much more radioactive than the uranium that comes out of the ground naturally. And so that our nation, even though we have a law against this, we try to protect ourselves, but it is superseded by the federal government and interstate commerce. And so, as Deb was saying earlier, that leaves us with no power. If the federal government can transport radioactive waste without even our nation as an indigenous nation or the general public, trying to address this, what can we do? The number one thing we have to do is stop making the waste and think of other solutions. We can't be transporting this stuff across the country to unknowing, unwilling, unconsenting communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Leona. Does anyone else want to address that topic? Deb? You're on mute, Deb.
Oh, there. So, I mean, one of the reasons my presentation, I talked about the fact that the waste from Yankee Row went 900 miles down to South Carolina. The wish to move the waste out west is 2,000 miles. CAN did a series of caravan of conscience tours in which we dogged the waste from Yankee Row all the way down to Barnwell, South Carolina, so that people along the transport routes would understand, one, that the waste was coming through their community because they were clueless. No one was letting them know that was happening. And two, that the destination of the waste
Come here.
and where it was being sent was reprehensible, so that they could understand that this could not continue. And in fact, communities began protesting the waste coming through, because this is a massive problem. I mean, they want to ship the waste from Row along a rickety railroad that runs along the Deerfield River, where there have already been rail transport cars that have fallen in the river and contaminated the river with all sorts of toxic substances. So the notion of those canisters being shipped along that river is terrifying. And the only thing that allows all of this to happen is that nobody knows it's taking place. It's our own ignorance that is the problem in this. And the job, our job, and the job of others is to wake people up to what's happening with this. Because once people wake up, they're not happy. And of course, the job of the nuclear industry and the federal government is to put people to sleep. And if you make people travel 400 miles to speak for 3 minutes, most people can't do it. They can't take off from work. They can't leave their children. They can't travel that far. Their car won't go 400 miles each way. And this is what the industry and the federal government rely on, the inability of ordinary people to participate in democracy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Deb. Dave, you have your hand up, and then we'll move into closing.
Yeah, just a real brief comment. This is a challenge to those who are on the call from the legislators' offices, from Senate and the House. If you folks can't pass the Build Back Better Act, you have absolutely no business shipping 90,000 tons of high-level radioactive waste all over the country to communities that don't want it, and actually make environmental justice and environmental health problems worse. So it's a matter of putting cart before horse here to suggest that we should have CIS when we don't even have the road and the rails available to ship it safely. So if there's any recommendation here, it's get your house in order, or our house in order, and fix the infrastructure first. Then come back and let's talk about moving radioactive waste.
Great, thank you, Dave. To wrap up, I'm going to put the contact information for the Radioactive Waste Coalition in the chat. If you want any more information or want to follow up with us, that's how you can reach us. I've also shared some resources from the coalition in the chat, including the 2 letters that we've sent to the House and the Senate and the White House. And so with that, I'll offer it to the presenters to offer some closing words. And so we'll just go one by one, and maybe starting with Leona and going in reverse order to Rose.
Sure, thank you for attending today, and apologies for, I forgot I put the pot on. I think the most important thing for me is just to remind you all that we need legislation for cleanup of other waste, not just this high-level waste, especially uranium waste. We also need to consider the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act and ways to keep that going. That's something very important to not just our people, but it's to help many people all over the country, and even people that are not in the country that were impacted. So I ask for both of those things: cleanup of uranium mines RECA, and then also stop making new waste. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Leona. Go next to Deb.
What I hope that can come of, so what I hope is that people can understand the crisis in nuclear waste at this point, and that the job is really to have the courage to take this issue on and actually fight for what's best in this, which is to find a way to deal with the most dangerous waste we've ever created without choosing to target people who can't protect themselves. And in a certain way, it's incumbent on everyone who participated in this, whether you're representing a legislator or you're just an ordinary citizen. In one sense, your job is to make people uncomfortable, to actually wake them up to the issues. I know we live in a world where everyone wants things to be groovy and nice, but in fact, things don't change when we're just talking groovy and nice. The job is really to take on the hard issues, be willing to share what happened today, hearing what we shared with you, and getting that message out, that they've got to take it on and they've got to do it right. And they have to do it right, and they have to move the waste once. Thank you.
Thank you, Deb. Turn it over to Dave.
I don't know if you can see the share screen at this point. This is
Yes,
really what we want to get across to Congress. I guess the message is, don't just do something, stand there. Get it done right the first time, and you've heard the principles by which it can be done right, and we urge you to ignore largely the BRC's recommendations and move in a different direction. Thanks.
Thank you, Dave. And Rose, can you help us wrap up?
Yes, I sure can. I think what I wanted to just add in conclusion is that where I live, New Mexico, it's called the land of enchantment. We have rivers, mountains, deserts. We have snow-capped ice skiing places. We have wonderful places to come visit. But littered through our state are those waste sites. We have a legacy we all have to deal with already. We don't need a centralized interim storage site in New Mexico at all. Let's shore up and harden the sites that are already contain the waste. Let's make it better and safer for those people until a final resting place can be found for this ugly waste that we created. And I will join any committee. I will speak with anyone that wants to go in this direction. I don't want my state to become a de facto dump for high-level irradiated commercial waste, brought here without consent, brought here in dangerous circumstances, and then told in 100 years that my children or grandchildren are still going to have to live with it. This has got to be solved, and I hope this is the generation that will do so. Let's not let this go any further. Thanks so very much for listening.
Great, thank you, Rose, and thanks to everybody for your time and your presence today. Again, if you want to get in touch with the National Radioactive Waste Coalition, you can find us on the web at radioactivewastecoalition.org, or you can email us at hello@radioactivewastecoalition.org. So thanks, everybody, and have a great day.